the earlier episode on startup ecosystems, we discussed how startup activity is not widespread in the country and its implications on business and policy. Continuing our conversation, with Mr. Srinivas Rao or MSR, we'll address the next big issue that we had wanted to discuss, which is related to the nature of funding activities in Indian startup and its link to the macroeconomic developments around the world that we see right now. There is a link between the macroeconomic environment and the nature of startup activity that might thrive. Only one part of that is somewhat obvious, which is as the macroeconomic environment tightens, such as the recession that analysts are talking about right now that might happen over the next year or two, startups should have less access to funding. So this is essentially a quantity argument which suggests that tightening of the macroeconomic environment should just reduce access to funds. As I had pointed out in the earlier episode, we are already seeing early trends of that happening in India. Another interesting dichotomy that some of us might have read about is not just the growing size of the startup ecosystem, at least in terms of the sheer number of startups. We have also been reading about several layoffs and a drop in funding, especially in 2022. Mr. MSR, how do you see these conflicting patterns? What explains maybe the coexistence of both these patterns? On one hand, we see the growth in terms of the number of startups, but we also hear about the tightening of funding. So how do you see the coexistence of both of these patterns?
Again, an answer to which there are multiple layers once you start peeling the onion. So I'll try, right? So I think it's fair to say that what happened, let's say not necessarily 2022, but 2021 onwards, is to some extent there's been a little bit of irrationality in the market, right? There's a little bit of, I hesitate to use the word irrational exuberance, but it's fair to say that there was a lot of liquidity, right? We had a blue swan event, which is the pandemic. So there was a lot of liquidity floating around. And obviously money has to be deployed, right? Money can't be sitting idle. So a lot of money was put into different asset classes, including the VCP space, right? Now, obviously, we have multiple factors at play. We have high inflation, high interest rates. There have been supply side shocks, thanks to a couple of geopolitical, and of course the pandemic and so on. So to some extent, rationality is returning, right? In the sense that I think both entrepreneurs as well as people who fund VCs are starting to recognize that they have to start focusing on building sustainable businesses. Not growth for the sake of growth, but growth allied to profitability, right? You cannot have a business; it's not a bottomless sink, right, where you just keep putting in money with no hope of a return, right? So I think that is the first part, that there is now a certain, I would say, it's more tempered. The environment is a little more tempered. Good ideas will continue to get funded, right? Good execution will be rewarded. Great teams. So if you combine teams, idea, product, and market size and all of that, I think the money will continue to happen. Because also remember, there's a lot of money which is there, in terms of the funding itself. There's a lot of money which is there. Funding, people invest in funds, LPs and so on, not for the funds to earn treasury income, but to actually deploy it, right? So it will happen. What we are starting to see is some of the, let's say, overheated nature of the market, right? I think that is starting to get corrected. We are starting to see a slowdown in terms of, like you said, 40%, 6.5 billion type of thing. But I think good ideas will continue to get funded. Good execution will continue to be rewarded, right? So I don't see, and these are all cycles, right? So these are all cycles. So cycle will turn, okay? And it's a question of, you think about it, right? in the last 20 years, we had the dot-com bust, we had the 2001 meltdown, we had the great financial crisis, we had COVID, and now we have this, right? And you think about all of this, right, as a student of economic history, like I'm sure you are, you will find that these are all cycles, and order will be restored sooner or later.
So while it appears that funding activity has surely slowed down, Mr. MSR also makes a very interesting point. Good startups will continue to get funded, he says. And how business cycles influence VC investment behavior has also been a subject matter of debate in the academic world. And the academic literature suggests that on the one hand, intuitively, many failures should occur from investments made during boom times simply because of lower discipline of VCs or external financiers and the relative ease of sourcing funds, due to which investors likely make ex ante worse investments during boom times. Alternatively put, many successful firms may be likely to be funded during recessions. On the other hand, better startups might be funded during boom times because it is during these times when investment opportunities are also attractive. Also, in a recent paper, Nanda and Croft suggests that it is plausible that VCs invest in riskier startups which actually have a larger upside during boom times, whereas they don't take such risks during difficult times. Alternatively put, it is plausible that during the boom times, the cost of experimentation for early stage investors is actually lower, thereby allowing them to make riskier and maybe more novel investments. And this is a question that I wanted to ask Mr. MSR. Let's talk about the impact of COVID-19, right? COVID-19 could be thought about as a shock, or a black swan event, a shock that was completely unexpected, at least by the VCs. What might have been the influence of COVID-19 on the startup ecosystem?
So Anand, when you think about this, right? So obviously, you had COVID, and so lots of socio-economic trends, right? So this whole thing about remote working, for example, right? So that drove adoption, for example, in several spaces around IT. Similarly, for example, if you take food and food tech, right? The fact that it was no longer viable for you to actually go out to and get to a mall or something, right? So it drove the whole the whole trend towards digitization got further accelerated. So we see that. Then healthcare, obviously now I think the healthcare, even for example in India context, sadly we spent even today less than 3% of our GDP on health. So I think that's something which people recognized, that there needs to be a lot more focus on something as fundamental as health. So you will see now a lot of trends. COVID, I think in some ways has helped companies also become leaner. I hesitate to say the word meaner, but much more agile. How do you deal with something which could happen? One never knows when the next black swan event is this thing. So in terms of some of these trends around work from home, how do you engage with remote workforce? How do you actually be able to deliver the same quality of experience to customers without physical interaction? So I think it has been positive largely. Some businesses, obviously travel, tourism, have taken a hit, obviously because of the nature of the sectors they are, but I think it's just a question of time.
That's a great point that you actually bring up. But now let's talk about the funding ecosystem. How was that impacted by the advent of COVID-19? Were there massive reallocations? Was there a lot of heterogeneity in funding opportunities and consequently in the kinds of sectors that were funded before versus after this black swan event?
A lot of capital, for example, which came into emerging markets, right? Because people started to look away from, for example, our neighbor to the north, right? For example. So a lot of that has happened. I think capital allocation to emerging markets, and I think, we referred to earlier in the conversation, right, that the last 2 years liquidity was abundant. A lot of that came into these markets. So that way it was positive. And what is now happening is a little bit of tempering. It's probably something which will last for a certain length of time. And then, by nature, I think one thing we have to recognize is markets by nature don't behave rationally, right? They're not designed to behave rationally. So this is a cycle, and I've mentioned we've had 5 cycles in the last 20 years. This is one more cycle.
Mr. MSR, I wanted to ask you another question. How do you think the global recession might influence the funding of Indian startups and consequently the growth of the startup ecosystem itself?
So obviously the nature of startup investments, everyone should know there is an inherent element of risk, right? So obviously money will start seeking safe havens, and I would say that startups should never be regarded. If anybody is thinking because of what has happened in the past that startups are a sure short way of scaling and growing money quickly, I think the answer is wrong. It is by nature a game of risk, right? And you have to balance risk versus return. So that's where I address my case.
Note that Mr. MSR certainly talks about the higher risk taking that happened in 2021. The decline of COVID or the arrival of COVID-19 means that all investments that were held back were suddenly available, and this somewhat created or made the market for capital a hot market in which there was perhaps a lot of money chasing just a few startups. But that is perhaps what might have resulted in what Mr. MSR calls as irrational investments. Whether a few of these would end up being novel experiments in the future is surely worth a watch. Also notice that Mr. MSR talks about the possibility that VCs might seek safer havens with COVID as well as when the recession actually kicks in. If the suspicion that many countries are likely to go into a prolonged recession comes true, it might actually reduce risk-taking and implicitly the funding of novel ideas themselves. It is also worth watching whether it would lead to funding of relatively banal startups that aren't as novel. In sum, the idea that economic downturns might not affect the volume of funding but also influence the nature of startups that get funded appears to be supported on the ground as well. Thank you, Mr. MSR, for the wonderful insights that you've provided us. It certainly helps us to think more about the theories that might be at play, which not only creates these ecosystems and sustains them as well. We also gained a lot of insights about how recession boom versus bust periods might influence the nature of startup funding as well.
Sure. Thank you, Anand.
Thank you for watching this episode of Interventions. We hope to come back with an equally interesting episode of Interventions in a few weeks.